Welcome to the participant story. Real people, real voices, and real experiences from inside clinical trials. In each episode, we sit down with a different guest to hear why they volunteered, what they experienced, and how participation in clinical research has changed their lives. The participant story is brought to you by Curevit Clinical Research. Curevit leverages technology, local healthcare infrastructure, and decentralized clinical trial elements to design and execute clinical trials where participants come first. Learn more about Curevit and their innovative virtual clinical site at curevit.io. The participant story is hosted by industry veteran and entrepreneur Dave Hanneman.
Good morning, Mindy.
Hi, Dave.
I really appreciate you joining us this morning on the Participant Story podcast. Welcome. We try to give people who have participated in clinical trials an opportunity to share their experience for others who may participate in the future, as well as for the industry to make sure that the industry is consistently hearing the real voice of people who've gone through the experiences that you've gone through. So thanks for being willing to share that this morning. It's an honor for me to have the opportunity to facilitate and ask these questions. My name is Dave Hanneman. I'm the host of the podcast, and the podcast is brought to us today by Curevit Clinical Research. So I want to thank them for their participation in this as well. So Mindy, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where do we find you this morning? Where do you consider home? A little bit about what you do for a living, some of your personal interests perhaps, and then would love to understand really the life perspective from which you come to this interview.
Yeah, my name is Mindy Cameron. I'm really grateful to be here today to talk about some of my experiences going back 20 years in participating in clinical research. I'm living in Carmel, Indiana right now after many years living abroad. I am the mother of two sons. I have a 29-year-old son and a 24-year-old son. And I work in the field of trying to get that patient voice included in all aspects of drug development. I work with sponsors. I work with patient advocacy groups. I work with health technology companies. But really what I'm here to talk about today is what I've experienced over 20 years of rare disease research participation. I first heard about clinical trials the same way as a lot of people first hear of clinical trials. My younger son got a pretty devastating diagnosis when he was 2 years old. I had never heard of the disease that affects him and in some ways affects me because I'm a carrier of it. He was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy when he was just under 3. We were living in Southern California at the time. Never had given clinical research much thought, didn't know a lot about research. I was interested in medicine. I worked as a journalist for 20 years overseas and in Washington, D.C. And so, I felt like I did know clinical trials existed, but I certainly never thought about what it would be like to participate in one from, a perspective of just having had a diagnosis and not participating because I was helping to answer a general health question, but because we were in a serious situation with our younger son, and he had a rare disease, and there wasn't a lot out there for treatments. There were a few things that we did anecdotally to treat these guys, but they weren't really addressing the root cause of the disease, and there was nothing that did. So we were faced with a diagnosis that generally takes life by mid-20s, but a progressive massive loss of abilities and progressing disability over the course of the short life. So it was pretty devastating to hear that news. And that's when I first really started hearing and thinking about clinical research.
I can't imagine hearing news like that. It also seems to me that it must be a very different experience to hear news like that and be exposed to clinical trials as a parent as opposed to a patient. It probably wraps quite a few things together. What was the connection between learning about the disease and then going through what you must have gone through there from the standpoint of treatment, but then connecting to clinical research? How did clinical research come into this picture?
I think I was a little bit unusual in that I was living in Southern California, and when you in the Duchenne muscular dystrophy community, when you get a new diagnosis, the community kind of rallies around you. Suddenly, somebody did have the wherewithal to tell me about some patient advocacy groups, one of which was located in the town I was living in, Newport Beach, California. So I was already heavily exposed to the fact that there were patient advocacy groups out there almost immediately. And then one of the parents who got a diagnosis similar to mine around the same time that I did was a researcher at UCLA. It was a married couple, and we all became friends because we had just gotten these diagnoses on our 3-year-old sons. But they just so happened to be leading researchers at UCLA. So they became highly motivated to start a research center at UCLA, and I got very involved in that effort. So as clinical trials at that point, they were mostly natural history studies. We were looking at the way these boys walked, at the way they metabolized drugs. Lots of natural history work had to be done so we could grasp a foundation to build a research ecosystem upon. So that was really how I started hearing about clinical trials. And I also lived in a pretty big metropolitan area, so access to a trial wasn't a big problem. There were a few things that we could get involved in, and we did.
Mm-hmm. What a amazing coincidence to have a support group like that. Well, what's been your experience with patient advocacy groups in general, or particularly to this one, in terms of its support for your ability to find not just the research, but the care that you needed?
We are very fortunate in Duchenne muscular dystrophy and the muscular dystrophies in general, in that we do have organizations that are long established that really look across the breadth of patient needs and try to fill them. So there are many in Duchenne. We are very lucky like that. I started out in doing my rare disease career as a volunteer for all the different organizations. So the Duchenne community has been amazing. We are incredibly supportive. This is a very heartbreaking diagnosis because you do watch your children lose all their abilities physically. It's a big disease from a caregiving standpoint. Lots of things to think about planning for your future. It's a disease that really does require a lot of support. So that has definitely been there. A big thing that happened in our community is, I've been around long enough that I remember this. That's kind of scary. Social media, it really kind of set our world on fire. We were suddenly able to find each other online. And that really was a defining moment in how not only patient advocacy groups could help each other, but just patients. You didn't have to belong. You didn't have to be fundraising for somebody. You didn't have to be part of the in crowd. You didn't have to be able to go to conferences. You could reach out to people right at your keyboard. That has been hugely significant. We have social media groups about how to travel with accessibility equipment, patient lifts and wheelchairs and toilet shower chairs and hospital beds and all the different pieces of equipment that we need. How to get financing for vans and which vans to get. How to dress these guys when if there's a problem in Duchenne land, all you have to do is reach out and somebody will have had an experience. And that's been such a blessing and a benefit for our community. I know social media can be problematic from a drug development standpoint when patients start talking to each other. But as far as that support and that feeling that you're not really alone, it's a tremendous gift. It's been a real Duchenne has taken some things away from my expectations about life, but as far as having a support group and just being connected with fantastic people who get it, because a lot of people can't even imagine what a diagnosis like this really means. So having such easy access to others that do is I think it's probably why I'm still here.
It sounds like the journey started for your son and you with what you described as natural history research, and then led to actual enrollment in clinical trials. What was that process?
I think I thought about my experience in clinical trials, and I think it really breaks down into when he was young and we didn't have anything available, and that there were only a few companies even looking at potential therapeutics. A lot of our advocacy leadership realized that what we are going to need is really strong foundational research for companies to come in and work with. It's a progressive muscle loss, so boys progress at different rates. The end result is always the same. This disease is lethal, and eventually the boys will succumb to some side effect of the disease or the disease itself. But the progression is pretty variable. So we knew we had to do a lot of work there. So that was the motivation at first. I lived, and I think where I lived, as I said before, played a part in that. It wasn't hard for me to participate in some of these studies. And then a few years after his first gait study, gait as in like how he walked, a huge trial opened up for imaging, looking for imaging biomarkers in these guys and how we could capture muscle deterioration with imaging. And that was a gigantic study. That was only in 2 locations across the country. So people were flocking to participate in that. And that was a real, what a moment when so many parents were piling into an observational study. So I think that really spoke to the dedication of our community. And then as he got older and he stopped walking very well, he never walked well, but he walked until he was 12. A fracture actually took him off his feet finally, but he was walking very precariously before that. So obviously, as trials opened up and as people were looking at different things, I became, I'll say desperate. I think that's a fair word. It's not a word we like to say that could portray us parents, but you do. You see a milestone coming and you don't want that milestone to arrive. So that is really what was the motivation in his late tens years, like 9, 10, 11. And then after he lost ambulation, unfortunately, he became ineligible for a lot of our trials because they rely on outcome measures that are related to walking. So at that point, he was off his feet. And then we started thinking, well, what will ultimately, now that he can't walk, we can expect progressive loss of upper body mobility as well. At 24, he's now losing a lot of trunk stability. So it's a cruel, terrible, absolutely devastating to watch muscle loss. But at the end, in the clinical trial that he's currently in, is with an investigational product, and at that it's addressing heart function. So because the heart is a muscle, cardiac problems are usually what takes these boys in the end. So now we are in a trial that's addressing cardiac function. So that's how I kind of prioritize what my motivation was for participating in research. It changed for sure.
And so it sounds like he has participated in several clinical trials over the years. Any sense of how many?
8.
8.
I know how many. I get asked that all the time. Well, between he and I found out that I was a carrier of this condition when he was about 7 years old. And I enrolled in a natural history study for carriers of the condition. So women, it's an X-linked genetic disorder. So women carry the gene. And sometimes we can have I don't want to say milder because some carriers are pretty profoundly affected, but it's slightly later. Well, it is later in life, and I would say for the most part, carriers are affected from a cardiac standpoint, but there are carriers that have the skeletal muscle issues as well. So that's included in that 8. So we've been in that big imaging study that I told you opened up, that so many people participated in. We've been in a natural history study looking at his gait. We've been in a regular natural history study, just longitudinal data. We're in a cardiac study. He did at one point. We looked at Viagra and Cialis in Duchenne because just to try to improve blood flow out to the muscles to see if we could kind of attenuate some of the muscle damage. Christopher was in both dosing studies for that trial. So he would go in. They were trying to find the optimal dose for treating boys with this. That was a particularly difficult one because he participated in all the dosing studies, all the blood that involved a lot of blood work. So he went through kind of a more burdensome experience for that.
Mm-hmm.
And then he stopped walking and couldn't get in the trial.
Mm.
So he did the dosing work and couldn't get into the trial. And that was pretty difficult. So in Duchenne also, I should point out something pretty important about Duchenne is we do have 8 approved therapies, but 5 of them are specific to a certain mutation type. So that reduces numbers significantly on who is eligible. And Christopher was never eligible for any of our exon skipping drugs or products because he does not have a skippable mutation. He has, there's all kinds of different mutations that occur in Duchenne, and he happens to have one that was not addressable with an exon skipping idea. So another therapy that we have is a gene therapy, and if you follow drug development at all, you will have heard about some of the things that have happened with the Duchenne gene therapy. That drug is no longer available to patients who can't walk. That is, it's commercially available to the ambulatory population in the U.S.
I see.
So we've had a lot of limitations on trials that we could participate in and commercial therapies that we can take. If you consider all of the clinical trials that have happened in the Duchenne space in the past 20 years, and I can talk about 20 years because that's how long I've been in this community. We had a lot of trials, as you can imagine, dozens and dozens and dozens of trials that he couldn't participate in. And maybe that was a lot of the reason why we did more natural history work, because he wasn't eligible for the interventional product trials.
Mm-hmm.
Which was difficult, which kind of really sucked for us because we saw other kids getting treated. None of our treatments are cures yet, but they have definitely made a significant improvement in some of the boys. And we were never eligible for all those trials. And that was honestly one of probably the hardest aspects of my Duchenne experience and my family's.
Sounds like there's a real irony here that participants often go through trials and all of the tribulations that those entail, but it's future generations or people that actually benefit from the research. Am I hearing that correctly?
Well, I love that you asked me that because over time, again, 20 years later, everything I've seen, everything that I have experienced, everything that the community has seen, and trials that hundreds of families have participated in, getting called off for futility or company running out of resources, or they couldn't enroll it for whatever reason, all the different things that have happened. Looking back now, yes, it's been absolutely worth participating. I can't say that I felt that way all the time over the past 20 years. Sometimes I felt very shut out of, wow, I wish if he only had that certain kind of mutation, maybe he would also have such a big benefit. But because he didn't qualify for any of the things that were putting dystrophin back, dystrophin is the missing protein, and these trials that he did not qualify for were looking to replace a version of dystrophin. So it was just not possible for him to participate in those kinds of things. So we enrolled him in a little small study looking at the heart. And he's now he's a very healthy 24-year-old. And I have to wonder if, despite all those years of thinking, if only we'd been able to get into a certain trial, we picked a trial that is looking really great, which is an amazing feeling. And I also want to say that my son, his name is Christopher. He does get a lot out of the idea that he helped get us here, even though he can't take a lot of the therapies that resulted from these years of research. He wishes that he could take the product. I'm not going to totally Pollyanna paint it, but it does bring him some level of comfort and of satisfaction that he participated.
How does that show up in Christopher's life? That pride, perhaps, or sense of meaning or purpose that
For
you're
sure.
referencing? How does it show up in his life, in his interactions with his caregivers or investigators or fellow patients?
Well, this wasn't a research project, but there is a paper out there. He survived an episode of what we call fat embolism syndrome. It's when you can have a fracture in the bone marrow inside the little fat, I call them fat globules. It's not very scientific, but that's what I call them. When the bone breaks, these little fat globules get released into the bloodstream. And when you have diminished mobility, or when you have muscle that's full of fibrotic scar tissue, those little fat globules can get trapped in lungs and brain, and it can be a very deadly situation. So Christopher had this happen. I won't tell you, it was an accident. He had an unknown fracture, unknown to us. It was a small fracture. And then he got very neurologically and respiratorily ill. So he did actually flatline. He coded in hospital, and they were able to revive him. It was a very serious episode of FES. The only reason he survived it is because he was in an ER when he had the cardiac arrest. So that team, who had never seen FES before, we had a hard time kind of convincing the medical establishment for a long time that FES was really a thing. Now they get it. A lot of boys with Duchenne would pass away after sustaining a fracture, and this is why. So Christopher survived it, and the team that brought him through that at Riley Children's in Indianapolis wrote a paper about it. And it's really one of the best papers about if a kid with Duchenne comes in to your ER and he's got a fracture, watch out for this condition. And if he exhibits certain symptoms, here's how you could think about treating it. There was hardly anything out there. So that paper now, every time we have a community member that gets FES, I send him that paper, and I always tell Christopher, and I'm like, another kid that you're helping. So that is hugely, he's very proud of that paper. And these kids have short lives, and everybody wants to know they left something behind. And participation, I hope that society and our sponsors that are working in Duchenne come to realize how important that was to these guys. So I wish that we did a better job of recognizing all the kids that have participated in the hundreds of studies that have gone on over the past, I'd say 50 years. I mean, there's been steady research into Duchenne for a long time, but in the past 20 years, it's really picked up. And he gets to answer that's a long answer to your question, but yes, he absolutely is glad that he could at least participate, and that the kids living now with Duchenne and the kids that are being born with Duchenne right now are going to have a much, much brighter future. More things to try, more treatments to try, more research, more hope. It's a complex disease. I don't know if we'll ever cure it. It's just systematic all over the body. It affects brain, it affects heart, it affects skeletal muscle, it affects digestive tract muscles. It is a big disease, but these boys that are born with Duchenne now have much brighter health outlooks.
You mentioned, I think, 8 trials, 8 projects, 8 studies that you've been involved with. It started with a diagnosis, started with natural history studies, at some point there was a first study and you had to learn about it, talk to people, consent to be part of it. What was that process and decision making like for you? And to the extent that your son and family participated, what was that initial process like to consent and enroll in your first study?
Well, since it was a natural history study, I didn't have a fear. I didn't have a fear of this is a new product that we're going to put in my son. I signed up because I'd heard about it. I was fortunate enough to live near a research center that was doing the gait study, so we signed up. Um, I had never participated in a clinical trial. The consent process was in person. Not too bad. The thing that surprised me the most about that trial that I never thought I would find hard or annoying, it was more annoying, is the PROs. Every time that we went, I'd have to fill out a survey, and Christopher would have to fill out a survey. He was only, I think he was 7 at this point. So, of course, I'm pretty much doing the survey for him. He was too young to really have to do it. But the hard thing was that study was about 3 years long, and it really was looking at decline. And that's why we were there. We were there to watch how the walking changed, and he was pretty symptomatic. He had trouble walking even when he was little. A lot of Duchenne boys walk normally when they're very young, but my son was pretty severely affected from a skeletal muscle standpoint even early. So he always had difficulty walking. So those PROs became so depressing to me that I'd have to sit there and fill them out, during in a cold white room while they're out doing some testing with Chris. And then Chris would have to come in and I'd have to basically ask him the very same questions. And of course, he didn't understand what was going on with his legs and his ability to walk. So I found the PROs stressful and a little bit sad. And I wish now that so much technology exists, this was a long time ago. This was like, I don't know, 15 years ago, 16 years ago. Now, how nice would it have been to do those like just on an iPad somewhere, like maybe at home even. Why we had to do those in the clinic, um, that was kind of a major inconvenience. And then to follow up with that, we did screen him. I don't count failed screen. Sorry, I can't say failed screenings. I can't say that I included screening for trials in the 8. So we did go through a pretty long process to screen for a gene therapy trial when he was 16. And he ended up not making it into that. But that informed consent felt a lot different to me because we were looking at a gene therapy that had, a reasonable potential to have side effects, an outside chance of death. That was a different animal looking at that informed consent. So I think it is much different to consider a natural history consent versus an interventional, product. That's a different animal.
You
But
mentioned fear earlier. Is this where the fear came in terms of making the decision to enroll in a trial or not enroll in a trial?
for sure, fear. And when you're talking about well, I don't know, when does a kid really become cognitively aware of disease and death and an expectation that they're going to have to go in and do something and take time off school and do this? I think at some point you are making, as a parent, you are making a very serious decision for your child. And what does the child want to do? And I think this is probably the most difficult thing about pediatric trials is, yes, these diseases are devastatingly serious, but Christopher was still having a beautiful life. He was still having a childhood. He still had the love of his family. He still was doing fun, he was still having a fun life. He still has a fun life. But making a kind of decision about something as serious as gene therapy on behalf of your kid who may be 12 years old and maybe like, well, I don't really want to go have gene therapy. I feel pretty good. I want to go on my school field trip. I want to do whatever's going on, because I haven't had to make the decision about gene therapy because now Christopher's a little bit old and very advanced in his disease now. But the parents that are having to make these decisions it's tough. It's the hardest thing. I struggled. We put kids with Duchenne on steroids early, and they have terrible side effects. And I struggled with that. So I can only imagine what parents are facing now as they try to make these decisions with some of these therapies. So I mean, I suppose it's a good choice to have to make. That at least you have the choice. At least you have a choice. We didn't have a choice with Chris, but still, I'm not. I never want to diminish the fact that they're making some pretty serious decisions for their kids.
It sounds like there's a natural tension between living one's life as a patient and participating in clinical research. And I'm hearing there's definitely a trade-off there between
sure.
just living one's life and going through these extra steps for research, not to mention the things you have to do for treatment already. Can you talk a little bit about those components?
Yeah, Duchenne clinical care is pretty intense. It's not as intense when the boys are super, super small, but ideally, a Duchenne patient is seeing 4 or 5 or 6 specialists. They are having to get those specialist appointments done at least annually. It's a rare disease, so sometimes families have to travel for that care. So it becomes kind of like a week where you're gone. You're traveling to a center of excellence to get this care. We have a great network of clinics across the country that excel in Duchenne care. They're called Certified Care Centers. MDA has them. PPMD has them. Cure Duchenne has them. So these are, but a lot of families still have to travel to those. So you have a high, I'll say burden. I know I need to stop using that word so much because I use it to describe a lot of what we go through, and I should think of some new words. But the burden of clinical trial participation, it is what it is. It's long days. It's days out of school. It's if you're in an interventional study that we have most of our exon skipping therapies are infusions, and they're given anywhere from weekly to every 6 weeks. The early kids, the kids that participated in our early exon skipping trials, were having to go to a trial center, which there was only one, if you can imagine. From all over the country, they were flying to Columbus once a week to get treatment. And they did that for 18 months, once a week. So yeah, these kids sacrificed a lot to participate in our early trials. So one of my biggest things I help companies think through is how to integrate that clinical care and that the trial expectations and trial requirements as well, because we have to start reducing the burden, because the clinical trials, you're going in some of our clinical trials, you're going in for blood work post dosing for a few months, once a week. So it's just a high burden. So for us, we tried to make it fun together time. But my son he had a lot of boys with Duchenne have some cognitive development that is different. It's not slower. It's just a little bit different. A lot of the boys are very shy and have a hard time with social situations. So certainly keeping Chris out of school for things like that weren't helping his 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 social prospects at school. But yeah, we tried to make it fun. Parents are great at doing that. Oh, we'll do the clinical trial and then we'll go to Disneyland because
they're still kids.
Well, and we had to pass through Anaheim on the way home, so we'd stop at Disneyland. But the big imaging study that I was mentioning earlier was at the University of Florida, and Orlando was like 45-minute drive away. So a lot of Duchenne kids got to go to Disney World.
Nice.
Yeah,
Nice.
yeah. On the day after, you couldn't go the day before because you would wear your muscles out too much, and your tests would be not as good as they. Well, it's better to do something more physical day after testing. So yeah, there's a lot of
and on a high note.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of considerations about how to schedule your clinical trial visit day around these in neuromuscular disease, about not being too tired, not having had a big day of physical activity the day before. There's a lot of muscle testing.
You mentioned burden and sacrifice, and you, as I recall, gave a few examples, everything from the PRO forms, patient reported outcomes forms, and the travel involved. Mindy, as you're probably well aware, the industry speaks a lot about bringing trials closer to patients and being patient-centric. And there have been a lot of efforts to develop technology and processes and so on, often described as decentralizing clinical trials or bringing them closer to the patient. Can you talk about what you've seen in the evolution over 20 years in terms of burden and sacrifice in the context of the industry's efforts to bring decentralized clinical trial elements to the trial?
Yeah, we've definitely seen a huge evolution over 20 years. So 20 years ago, when our first clinical trial started opening, parents were climbing all over each other to participate. We didn't have anything. We didn't have any treatments. We had a very devastating diagnosis. We had kids that were still easy to travel with when they're little. They're easier to go to participate in a clinical trial when you're not in a chair. Things become much more difficult once you lose ambulation about trial participation. So that is one area that I would definitely like to see more of, bringing that clinical care and that trial care into the same realm, so these patients don't have to miss double school and have to get into an MRI machine twice instead of once. We need to do a better job at sharing results. And I think, some of the tools that you think about when you think about decentralization could apply here too. We are definitely seeing more companies moving toward local labs. People can have their labs done locally. We haven't seen a huge shift toward total decentralization in Duchenne. Interestingly, a couple of our companies had to scramble when COVID happened, because all these trials were midway through and suddenly people couldn't come in for their clinical outcome assessments, which mostly involved physical functioning tests. So a couple of companies successfully pivoted toward home taken PROs, and FDA did give some flexibility there because we couldn't get our kids into clinic to get our trial visits done. So I think we had a couple of examples of companies that were able to handle it and a couple that weren't. So we were right in the middle of several clinical trials when suddenly kids couldn't come in for their visits.
You mentioned the companies that adapted to the challenges that COVID brought about. Tell me about how if I think about the industry, I think about sponsors, I think about investigators, staff, companies, technology, and the FDA and their guidance on trials, on research. How has the industry evolved over those 20 years from the perspective of a participant or a caregiver?
Not sure what you're asking.
Have you seen the industry adapt, whether it's the FDA, sponsors, investigators? Have you seen the industry adapt over 20 years or evolve toward a more patient-centric approach to research?
I think when you're talking chronically, yes. I do work with patients who have unrare. I don't know whether to call them chronic or common, but they're not considered rare diseases, and that has been one of the biggest eye openers to me ever. I work with a digital healthcare company, and they bring together a group of us pretty frequently, and we kind of go over all the products. We look at everything that they're doing. Um, to put that patient focus on it. I'd like to see more of that happening. Um, I think in rare disease, we struggle with getting buy-in for adaptive trial design. We're working hard on that not just in Duchenne, but the rare community in general. Running clinical trials in rare disease is different. You've got really long timelines. You've got patients at different levels of ability. You've got parents having to travel to participate because not every state is going to have a clinical expertise for a rare disease. So there's a lot of challenges in rare that you don't see elsewhere. So yes, we've made some changes. We've definitely gotten more buy-in about patient-reported outcomes and real-world evidence, how these patients are doing in their everyday lives. Capturing that and getting to a consensus where that stuff could be considered, is there a future where that's a primary outcome? Because, taking these kids out of their lives and it's only going to get harder as the patients get healthier and the desperation level is starting to go down a little bit. But we also have a situation now where families have choices of several therapies they can go on. Some kids are eligible for many of them. So parents want to try them in combination. How are we going to track that? How are we going to see how kids do when they're on more than one Duchenne therapy at the same time? So we have a lot of challenges that we're sorting out right now, but digital solutions and decentralization is a huge piece of that. We're looking to follow our gene therapy kids for a decade, or I think they should be followed even longer. But how does that look? We've got to come up with some decentralized solutions for that kind of thing because patients aren't going to keep coming in. They're not going to remain incentivized to participate in a observational study 10 years out from gene therapy when they're doing better and they're feeling good. So as expectations from these parents, as expectations from patients go up, so do our options. Some people like to go into clinic. Some people would rather have their assessments done. They'd rather have a nurse come to the home or get their labs done down at their local lab. There's a lot that can be done. Data sharing while you're in a clinical trial is something that is definitely a priority now. It's so many of our tests are done on the clinical trial side and then on the clinical care side, and being able to share relevant results with your clinical care team would be huge. I think that the perception that care is the same is wrong, though. We do have some experience in our community of, I'm in a clinical trial, so this A, B, or C was just looked at. No, you can't really ignore your clinical care piece. And then with the gene therapy experience that we've had, the commercial patients are really more on their own as far as treatment of side effects and things than they would have been if they'd been in a trial. So that we need to do a better job at educating parents. Well, you have a commercial product now. Things that happened and tests that were run during the clinical trial are not necessarily being run. It's your responsibility as a patient and parent to make sure those tests are getting done. And we need to be better at sharing data between the two parts of our world, the clinical research piece and the clinical care piece, but we also can't forget that they are distinct, and you can't ignore pieces of your clinical care because you're in a trial.
So you've experienced, and Christopher has experienced the industry evolve over 20 years. How would you like to see the industry evolve for patients, for participants over the next 20 years? And by the industry, again, I'm thinking sponsors, investigators, the FDA, the companies that provide the services.
Well, from the FDA, we need continued flexibility. The only reason that we have treatments for Duchenne is because of FDA flexibility. So, as I've said, it is different. So we do need a fair assessment of what is expected out of patients and what's expected out of sponsors. How long do you have to run a trial before you can? We have an issue right now with what's the ultimate outcome in cardiac measurements in Duchenne. Well, it's not death. We can't have death as an endpoint. These are kids. So we've got to make sure that our endpoints are understood. There's been a lot of change at FDA, so we want to make sure that all of the regulators looking at neuromuscular products do understand our endpoints. We've taken decades to establish some of our endpoints, so we need to make sure that everyone's got a robust understanding of that. Where I'd like to see it go, starting to make it easier for patients to participate. And decentralized solutions are a huge piece of that, but it's not, sometimes you have to go in. But if you have to go in for a blood lab or an imaging's huge. It's expensive. It's something that is difficult to have done, especially as our boys start losing mobility. It's difficult to get the MRI. So if they're doing an MRI for your clinical trial, make sure you share that with his care providers as well. To have that done twice is dumb, and it's a waste of it's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. We can share data without unblinding trials if it's an agreed upon scenario. So just more collaboration between clinical care and clinical research is my biggest thing. There's lots of little things that I'd like to see changed, but that's the big one.
How has participation in clinical research and your experience as a caregiver for a patient, how has that influenced you personally and professionally?
From a health standpoint, for me personally, the fact that I got to participate in a natural history study about cardiac health in carriers of DMD, I don't know, I wouldn't say it saved my life, but it definitely detected a heart issue that I have that is absolutely managed with medication and healthy lifestyle. So that's a simple answer to your question, and I can get more into bigger picture items. But from a really simplistic view, participating in that natural history study helped me have a much better long-term health outlook. I guess my perceptions about clinical research have changed over the years. Looking back over 20 years, it's been a heck of a ride. I'm glad that I have participated. It's extremely fulfilling to see that we have gotten somewhere in it. I know a lot of rare disease community patients who don't have 8 treatments and are having trouble getting that translational research and, grabbed by a company and further developed. So by being involved in the rare disease community at large, I feel lucky that has so much attention has been placed on Duchenne for good and bad. It's been a controversial ride. We've had more flexibility than some people think we should have had, which I struggle with that. I think it's easy to say this design wasn't perfect. This wasn't this outcome wasn't met. But look further. Just because a primary that was set in a disease where endpoints are hard, just because that primary wasn't met, keep looking, because overall the patients are going to look better. Our cardiac outcomes are very problematic because, as I said, sometimes they want to see mortality as the endpoint. But when you're a Duchenne patient, say you're 24 years old. Let's take my son, for instance. He's 24. He has Duchenne. He's extremely progressed in the disease. He's having trouble even feeding himself now. His heart is healthy, and that keeps him going. you can't see the heart. You can't really, these patients are non-ambulatory, so they're not out there exercising. They're not running a mile. So, the heart stability is important, and it's not easy to see, and it's not easy to detect. But the mere fact that he knows his heart function is still good is an outcome to consider seriously. So I think we need to have more flexibility and more creativity on how we look at endpoints in diseases of this nature.
Has this experience influenced your professional life, changed the direction of your professional life in any way over the last 20 years?
Yes. I now work at actually reviewing protocols and reviewing informed consents. I do a lot of work advising companies on why this or that in their protocol isn't going to work or is a good idea, or maybe take it further, maybe allow those options. A big thing that I notice a lot of sponsors leave out is that caregiver consideration. When you're working with, well, there's a lot of research going on in like neurocognitive stuff too. So like a lot of the Alzheimer's trials, a lot of those patients are going to be coming in with someone else. So making sure that everyone's taken care of on clinical trial day. Yeah, the sky's the limit, really. With involving patients in all aspects of what you're doing is going to get you there faster. I do know that.
How has this experience influenced Christopher's personal and professional, to the extent that he's pursuing interests? How has his experience influenced his evolution as a young man?
Well, in addition to really appreciating the fact that he participated in the early research, he's finishing up his senior year at college. He's got a English and media studies degree. He's planning for a career. He just got his first job. He's planning,
Congratulations.
he's thinking about how he's going to live independently, which is going to be a heavy lift. He needs help with most things, as far as taking care of himself. I'd like to see more resources put toward independence for patients like him, not just with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, but, it's difficult to live with a disability in this country. He's got income limitations. It's going to be very difficult for him to be independent because he needs help getting to work. And once he gets to work, he needs accommodations and he needs benefits. He needs health insurance if he's going to work. And lots of companies who are, self-funded commercial plans, they're reluctant to bring on expensive patients. So these patients should stay on Medicaid, but give them the opportunity to make enough money so they don't lose that, or let them buy in. There's a million different creative strategies out there for independent living. So that's kind of my next chapter, I think, in advocacy is how we've moved the needle for a lot of rare disease, but we still have lots of patients with varying degrees of disease effects and disability. So making sure they have good quality of life and that we're not just extending life, but we're maintaining quality of life as well.
As a parent, as a participant yourself, and as a caregiver for a participant, what advice would you give, or what message would you like to send to someone who's considering clinical research for themselves or their children today?
Know what's expected of you. It's a two-way street. Sponsors and CROs have a lot of responsibilities toward patients, but patients have a part to play in this. And if you are signing up for a clinical trial, you have to follow through. You have to stay adherent. Post-trial, if you're enrolling in a long-term follow-up study, you've got to make sure that you're serious about that and that you are willing to take on that responsibility. That's a big one. Even with our gene therapies, people think, oh, I got treated and I'm going to be able to walk away from all this now. No, that's not really the case. If you're lucky enough to benefit from one of these early therapies, please stay involved and help us figure out what it looks like long term. And then the other thing that I would advise parents is ask. If there's a piece of that trial that you think, hmm, could you share that result with my clinical care team? Ask. Um, the most that anybody can do is say no. So if you've got something that you see in that protocol or in that informed consent that you think, yeah, we'll go in for weekly labs, but can you pull A, B, and C so I can share that with my clinical care team? That would help. So in addition to calling on sponsors to do a better job of putting that in their protocols, parents and patients can ask. I asked. One of the reasons why my son doesn't have to do a cardiac MRI for his clinical care and his clinical trials, because I said, hey, we'll do it if you do this. So
So
I would say that.
advocating on one's own behalf is still an important strategy.
Yep. I think so. Doesn't hurt.
So you touched on this. How's Christopher doing now?
Yeah, he's an intelligent young man. You only have to do a Google search of Duchenne muscular dystrophy to see what it is and what he can expect going forward. He's lost a lot of mobility in his trunk the past year. Um, you know, Duchenne patients used to pass away, unfortunately, by the time they were in their early 20s. So some of the things that we're seeing with Duchenne now, we didn't see before because respiratory failure or cardiac failure had already happened. So now that we have moved the needle and these boys are doing so much better, we are seeing new things. And this loss of trunk stability has been a surprise to me. The caregiving uh, requirement has definitely increased because of this new loss. Um, we have a lot of boys now on long-term ventilation. We're having more sudden cardiac death instead of like cardiomyopathy and like heart failure kinds of deaths. We're seeing more sudden deaths, and those are usually arrhythmias caused by all the fibrosis that builds up in the heart because of the disease. We're seeing that. We're seeing a lot more. I think that we're probably seeing more depression. My son definitely knows he's not going to ever regain anything, and he's in a highly um, vulnerable state with his disability. He relies on other people to do everything for him. Another reason I want to talk about independent living and opportunities for independence. It's a very difficult disease in that way.
Mindy, is there anything that I should have asked you that I haven't, or anything else you'd like to share about your journey or Christopher's journey?
I feel like I was all over the place, but
I don't. I
yeah.
felt like you were on point all the way through.
Well, yeah, it's a lot to say. It's been a long journey. It's been full of incredible highs that are full of hope. I was on a webinar yesterday and I said, hope is what keeps us going, and we need a steady supply of hope. We are at a place with Duchenne that so much has been learned and so much progress has been made. And the idea that funding for research may change or slow, um, that's incredibly concerning to me and to my community because we need full pipelines full of the next thing. A lot of our drugs are first generation. Insulin used to be first generation, and now it's much improved. So just because one of our therapies out there in the media is saying, well, this isn't as effective as people had hoped. Well, it's the first generation. We have I would say at least 40 companies working in the Duchenne space in some capacity, whether they're addressing dystrophin replacement or some downstream effect of the disease or a cardiac outcome. Maybe it's a sensor that's going to help measure PROs better in the real world for these guys. There's just a lot of research going on in Duchenne, and to have a pipeline dry up when we're this close is incredibly worrisome.
Well, thank you for sharing your journey and for sharing Christopher's journey. It's been really an honor for me to listen. And maybe most importantly, thank you for your sacrifice, for Christopher's sacrifice, and especially for your contribution and Christopher's contribution to research. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you. It was really nice to meet you, and it's my first podcast, so
Well, thank you very much.
thank you.
The participant story is brought to you by Curevit Clinical Research. Curevit leverages technology, local healthcare infrastructure, and decentralized clinical trial elements to design and execute clinical trials where participants come first. Learn more about Curevit and their innovative virtual clinical site at curevit.io.